Hey, welcome everybody. My name is Andy Miller. I coordinate the seminar for the department. In a moment, I'm going to ask Philip Worcester to introduce our speaker. Before I do, I just want to say a word about our next seminar, which is coming up 2 weeks from today. Everybody gets a well-deserved break for spring break coming up next week. The seminar 2 weeks from today on March 29th will be given by Dr. Andrea Roberts, who is from the University of Virginia School of Architecture, and she is the director of something called the Texas Freedom Colonies Project, which is a really interesting project. You'll hear more about that when she comes. The title of her talk is Co-Creating Narratives, Counter-Narratives, Foundations for Just Planning and Preservation. So you'll hear more about that at the time, and we'll be putting out an announcement about that after we are done with today's seminar. So I'm going to stop sharing screen. I'm going to ask Philip to go up and introduce our speaker, and then she will share screen and we will proceed.
Good afternoon. I'd like to introduce Bella Dastvan. Bella Dastvan is a GES alum who's currently working in the Strategic Energy Innovation Climate Corps program as a sustainability fellow at UMBC Office of Sustainability. Bella is developing an invasive species management plan for campus, which includes, but is not limited to, land use, history of UMBC, existing site conditions, goals and objectives, management priorities, monitoring practices, and best management practices for target invasive species. Bella has many interests, including horticulture, sustainable agriculture, and forest conservation. She was recently published as a leading author in the aquaponics research project on cut flower production during her time working at Grateful Gardeners, an organic sustainable flower farm. Some fun facts about Bella: she loves spending time hiking outdoors, playing piano and guitar, singing, and songwriting.
Okay, welcome, Bella. Go ahead and share your screen with the WebEx so we can see it there.
Thank you. Awesome. Hello, everyone. Thank you for introducing me. I am developing an invasive species management plan for UMBC's campus, and I'm very excited to present to you for the Department of GES seminar. So I first wanted to explain what Strategic Energy Innovations is. They're actually an environmental nonprofit organization based in California. They're striving to build leaders to drive sustainability solutions. And part of that mission is through the Climate Corps Fellowship Program. It's provided for recent college graduates to gain some leadership skills and work with local governments, schools, nonprofit and for-profit businesses, and implementing sustainability and resiliency projects. So my fellowship is a 10-month full-time fellowship at the UMBC Office of Sustainability, and that's located within facilities management. So I'm working with both organizations and departments. So a little bit more about the Office of Sustainability. We collaborate with campus stakeholders to implement sustainable systems and practices, report, measure, and analyze the campus footprint, and that includes carbon pollution, water, greenhouse gas emissions, implementing the UMBC Climate Action Plan, and engaging and empowering UMBC's community to get involved. So my mission from the fellowship also ties in with the mission of the Office of Sustainability. So a little bit more about the Climate Corps Fellowship Program in specifics. The main project of this fellowship is researching best practices to produce an invasive species management plan for campus. The UMBC Office of Sustainability requested that this be the #1 priority for the fellowship because we need to protect our forests on campus, especially the old growth forests in the Knoll, in the Conservation Environmental Research Area, or SARA. We gotta protect the trees and save the trees that we already have. And yes, planting trees is a great solution, but we won't see those benefits and impacts for decades. So we got to protect the old growth forests that we have currently. There's a great opportunity for skill development using ArcGIS Pro and also research techniques. I noticed that I was able to apply a lot from my time as a GES major at UMBC with the introductory courses in GIS and also introductory courses I took as a grad student. That included the 701 course where we built up a literature review and drafted it. And I tried to replicate what I learned from that literature review, creating that outline, making sure that you're getting the full scope of the issue and topic at hand, making sure that you're addressing any concerns, constraints, and alternative solutions. So I tried to use what I learned as a student for this fellowship, and it was very beneficial to get me some really good progress with this project. I've had some great opportunity to collaborate and reach out with internal and external stakeholders, internal meaning on campus. So the Office of Sustainability, Facilities Management, you guys in the Department of GES, and also environmental organizations like the Environmental Task Force Club, SGA, and the UMBC Dining Services, Chartwells. Also external stakeholders, other universities within the university system of Maryland, especially Towson University, and also just across the coast, reaching out to people who are experts in the field of invasive species. And I came into this fellowship having very little knowledge of invasive species. I've helped with some volunteer events doing invasive plant pulling. So, you know, a lot of what I learned was on the job. So it was great to be able to use community outreach skills to reach out to people who had knowledge in the field, share the work that I'm doing and learn about the work that they're doing. And having that platform for knowledge exchange is really important. Also with the Environmental Task Force Club, we are trying to start up the invasive plant species cleanups. We did one last month, and we're trying to get that going for the semester as well. So what makes an invasive species invasive? It's an introduced non-native organism, and that can be a disease, a parasite, a plant, insect, or animal, and that begins to spread or expand its range from the site of its original introduction. So I have some pictures of invasive plants that I found on campus when I did a survey last semester. To the right on top, we see kudzu. This is actually by the silo. It's created a huge blanket over the native trees and understory. And kudzu was actually intentionally introduced back in the 1930s, I believe, or maybe earlier, but during the 1930s to 1950s, farmers were actually encouraged to plant kudzu as like an erosion control cover crop. And same thing with porcelain berry, it was intentionally introduced as for cultivation of a landscape and ornamental plant. So these were plants that escaped their original site of introduction and is causing a lot of issues for the native plant species in our natural spaces. But there's also unintentional introduction of invasive species. So it's a mix of people just not knowing the consequences at the time and then experiencing those consequences and effect later. So it's a lot of trial and error, but we do need to create a management plan in order to manage our natural spaces and stop this from spreading. According to the Department of Interior, they define invasive species as non-native species whose introduction does or is likely to cause ecological or economic harm and is a threat to human health. And they grow aggressively, they reproduce rapidly, and they displace native species, outcompeting them. And this causes a major disturbance to the areas where they're present, but they're usually in areas that are already disturbed by human land use. And it's very fascinating to learn about invasion biology, and invasive species are a reflection of human land use disturbance. So it's important to keep that in mind and take accountability and responsibility for this so we can move forward and protect our natural spaces. Researchers found that approximately 40% of forested land in the United States is under threat from invasive species. And such pests are already killing so many trees that 6 million tons of carbon is released in the atmosphere each year. And this is a big issue, especially with facing the impacts of climate change. We want to create resilient ecosystems in our communities and natural spaces. So we really need to protect our old growth forests. And there are connections with climate change, and we are experiencing that to this day and going forward. And there's increased growth and density of invasive species due to higher carbon dioxide levels, and plants love carbon dioxide. That goes for invasive and native plants. And also with the warmer temperatures and drought and extreme weather conditions, there's going to be more stress put on the trees, and there will be more abundant pests. And invasive species take advantage of the earlier spring warm-up by sprouting and leafing out long before native species. We're already experiencing that this year with the very mild winter that we have, and just very on and off weather patterns. Also just being a Marylander, we're pretty used to that by now, but it is going to get worse and more extreme. So it is important to keep that in mind when making a management plan for now, but also for the future. And also terrestrial plants and forest pest species are moving further north with rain shifts. So we're going to start experiencing weather patterns from, like the south as time goes on. So it's important to keep that in mind when you're managing invasive species that you already have, being on the lookout for newly introduced invasive species that the south is already experiencing, and then also making sure that you are having native plants that are resilient and adaptable with the growing weather, the growth expansion with the growth zones, because we're going to be having a shift. So we're not going to be so much the north or mid-Atlantic per se, but we're going to be more south over time. So it's important to keep that in mind going forward. I also wanted to recommend checking out EdMaps. It's a really useful data source, but there are some pros and cons of crowdsourcing data and having things reported. So it's not entirely accurate per se, but people are posting reports of what they've noticed. So for example, the top map is a current distribution map of kudzu. So we already see it a lot in the south, hence the vine that ate the south. And in the middle map, it's future prediction distribution map. So on the right in the legend, there's 13 different models that were combined to show different outcomes. So kudzu, yes, is in the south, but it will start to reach up to the Midwest and the Northeast, and also on the West Coast as well, we're seeing. So it's important to keep that in mind with the growing or changing weather patterns and the changing growth zones. I wanted to give a fellowship timeline to briefly go over what I was able to do each month and was able to accomplish. So I started this fellowship in mid-August. So during that end of the month in September, was just getting acclimated to being in a professional setting, meeting facilities management and the Office of Sustainability and the Eco Ambassadors, and learning what everyone is doing on campus and what their work is going towards. So there's really good informational period of my fellowship that's still ongoing, but this was really emphasized during that first month, just getting to know who I'm working with, what I'm working with in terms of the invasive plants on campus, and just doing research with invasive plants, the invasion biology. I have some screenshots of different resources that I've used from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, the University of Maryland Extension is also a really great resource that I recommend looking into. And also just management plans that other states have posted and different guides on how to create an effective management plan. So it was very much collecting a lot of resources and just a lot of reading. So that was really important to just make sure that I knew exactly what I was working with, the common invasive plant on campus, so that way I could go forward to do a survey of campus to look at the invasive plant coverage and distribution. This was also a great time for expert and stakeholder outreach and just learning more from people in the field who have working experience with invasive plants, what they found to be beneficial in terms of control, what to keep in mind for management. And I started that campus survey, which I'll talk about in the next slide. So in October, I walked about 100 miles over the month, 512 acres of campus, quite a lot to work with, especially in the amount of invasive plants. I counted about over 100 different invasive plants on campus. I was able to narrow that down to the top 40, which is the best I could do, but there is a lot that we are working with. So it was a challenge, but also an opportunity to prioritize the invasive plants that we really need to manage and work with. The UMBC facilities management and the campus planning department uses a grid reference system. So I was able to use this grid reference system and then take that file and plug it into an app called ArcGIS Field Maps. That way I could actually see where my GPS location was on campus. And it was a very informal survey to just get a preliminary idea of like what invasive species we're dealing with, what the coverage looks like. So I basically walked around each grid and just gave an estimate of low, medium, and high coverage. Low would mean ranked as like a 1, under 0.25% of that grid, medium being 0.25% to 0.5%, and then high being over 50%. So that's what I did during the month of October, trying to race against time with while everything was still green and leafing. And then over that month, I also collaborated with Chartwell's, UMBC's dining vendor. they had a few invasive species meal day tabling events where they were cooking up and preparing invasive Chesapeake Bay blue catfish. So it was a great opportunity to talk with students and tell them about what was going on, and also just talk more about invasive species in general, the issue on campus, providing points of contact, hiking etiquette as well. So that way people were engaged and aware and knew who to go to if they had questions. And it's also pretty delicious, I will say. So there's different ways that we can manage invasive species, and sometimes we can eat them. From the invasive plant survey in the fall, I wanted to highlight the top 3 invasive plants of concern. It's definitely not limited to this, but these were the ones I wanted to highlight and expand on. So English ivy and porcelain berry, they both have a similar nature in that they can grow on any level of the forest ecosystem. So we're talking about the ground cover, the herbaceous layer, the understory to the canopy. So we see how they create these blankets over trees. And especially with English ivy, there's an issue with, or both English ivy and porcelain berry, there's an issue with, if it's blanketing over trees, trees can't fully do photosynthesis, right? If it's blocking out the sunlight, they can't fully grow and produce more growth for the trees or even reproduction. And with English ivy, there's a bacterial leaf scorch that's associated with it. So that's something that's an issue for the bark as well on the trees that's affecting. And that's especially an issue for oak trees and maple trees and some ornamental trees. So it's definitely, we're not going to be able to completely get rid of these invasive plants, every leaf, every root, every seed. But it is important to establish a long-term control plan for especially these type of invasive plants that are able to reproduce and spread like this. The third plant is wavy leaf basket grass. It's relatively new. It was actually discovered in Patapsco Valley State Park in 1997. And it spreads like crazy. Most of this forest floor in this picture is wavy leaf basket grass. And they have these sticker seeds on top. If you've gone hiking in the woods and found a bunch of seeds all over your pants, your shoes, if you have a dog, it could get all over your dog. And unfortunately, it spreads accidentally that way. So it's very important to understand the different types of ways that invasive species can spread, whether it's vegetation, by the roots or the rhizomes or by seed, also by wind or by water. So it's important to keep all of this in mind. In November, I did some interesting things and seemingly not so interesting things. I started out doing a goat hike. So I connected with Dr. James Full. He is on the committee for the Glen Arboretum at Towson University, which is their natural space. And he's working with Ronnie Castley. She is from Harmony Church Farm, and she brings out her goats to the Arboretum to have a invasive plant goat eating day. So she'll pen off her goats in a small area. Students will come by and ask questions and talk with the professors and Ronnie and landscape managers, and they'll do volunteering events. So we'll have the goats go in one area, try to clear as much invasive plants as possible. And I will say goats will eat everything, so you gotta pay attention to where they're eating and what they're eating. So it's a great way of providing an eco-friendly solution to invasive plant management. That way they're able to take a good dent out of that area, and then people can come and pick up the remaining roots and leaves from that area and move forward. So that was a great experience, and I got to meet Ronnie and go on a goat hike with her in November to talk more about how we could maybe do this on campus. It's a great way to get students involved and engaged and some friendly faces on campus, and also get people volunteering and part of that solution. The rest of the month was a lot of data analysis, quality assurance, quality control, taking the survey notes that I took and the rankings from each grid, and then putting them into a survey that was compatible with ArcGIS. And I think we all know the fight with ArcGIS pretty well. So it was a lot of trial and error, but trying to get the spreadsheet compatible to make the maps was really important. So you'll see, if you can see, it's kind of small, but I put the coding for the different like 0, 1, 2, 3, 0 for being like not found in that grid, but also I will note that there are some areas that I couldn't get to just because of steep slopes, or even like really big patches of wavy leaf basket grass, because you want to avoid walking through it, otherwise you're just spreading it. So that was something that did impact the survey, but it was something I wanted to point out because it is an ongoing issue. And just doing invasive plant research, understanding more about how the plant spreads and different plant spreads, and prioritizing which plants to really look at for the management plan. In December, I was finalizing the maps in ArcGIS. So I made maps of the around 100 species. This is an example of English ivy. So I took from that spreadsheet over here into here and changed the color so you could see where there were high areas of English ivy versus low areas. So the higher areas, we're going to need to have long-term management plans. For the lower areas would be short-term management. And it's actually beneficial to work in the areas where it's lowest and then work towards the areas that are medium and high and so on. Also, I've been helping with the Forest Geo Campus Tree Inventory with Anita Kramer. She did the inventory 5 years ago. So we were coming back to measure the trees, tag the trees, look for any new ones. And this is an example of one of the papers that we take notes on. So part of this is measuring the tree's diameter at breast height. And down here, this is an example of how to do that. So it's about 4.5 feet tall. And we have a stick that is that tall. So you just put it up to the tree and then use the special measuring tape to look at what the diameter is of that tree. And just look at comparing what the measurements were from the past versus the future, so you can see if there is growth, if there wasn't growth, if the trees, the diameter even shrunk from stress. And also tagging trees as well, making sure that everything is plotted appropriately. Also, researching best management practices was another key part of my time during December. We want to keep in mind integrated pest management, which I'll talk about in the next slide. So there was something that was pretty concerning to me reading through government, state agencies, even academic institutions. There's so much research that's done with invasion biology, but when it comes to control methods, almost always herbicides, especially glyphosate, are mentioned. So we don't want to completely rely on herbicides, and there's definitely a debate on whether or not it impacts the environment. And it's was first commercialized as the trade name Roundup by Monsanto in 1976, and it was advertised as an efficient plant killer. But efficiency and effectiveness don't always equal safety. Up on the top, I actually grabbed an article from my class in Global Environmental Change, GES 636 with Dave Lansing. And this definitely came back to memory when I was going through the best management practices. And it was something that was really concerning. So I reached out to him and reached out to people in the GES department to talk more about it, and just definitely kept it in mind when creating this management plan. And Monsanto scientists claim that there wasn't any harm or bioaccumulation in the soil, water, and mammals. It's heavily promoted by agencies that we're supposed to rely on. But there's also research that points to links between glyphosate and health risks and bioaccumulation in the environment. Although the EPA claims it's non-carcinogenic based on their changing thresholds, which is something that's concerning. And it is important to follow the labels. I know that there are, because it's so widely used in a professional and personal use, some people aren't always using it based on the guidelines and the laws. So that's another issue when it comes to contamination in the environment. So it's important to read the label, but it's also important not to fully rely on herbicides. In order to have an effective management plan, you need to have a combination of cultural control, physical and mechanical control, biological control before you rely on chemical control. So that's why this pyramid is really important when it comes to priorities. And prevention is the first thing, making sure that you have a monitoring plan in practice. And it's the ultimate challenge. It's a juggling act for sure, but it's something to really keep in mind because as a research campus, as a campus with a climate action plan who wants to be environmentally conscious, we need to keep this in mind going forward. So that way everyone's on the same page and has these best management practices in mind. And we're able to do this effectively, but also safely. In January, this was making more maps. I made some composite maps I'll show in the next slide. And this was when I started drafting the management plan with everything I was gathering. So below, I have an example of best management practices for wavy leaf basket grass. I included the flower fruit period and the time that you're supposed to pull and dig it, because you want to do that before it goes to seed and spreads even more. So during the spring to midsummer would be the best time to do that. So really focusing on hand pulling, manual removal. There are foliar herbicide applications that are an option, but I want to keep in mind there are different ways of applying herbicides. We want to try to use the certain methods that have the least amount of herbicide use, so that way it's a lower cost and something that isn't running off. So other herbicide methods that would be appropriate, especially for like invasive shrubs, is called a cut stump method. So that's where you cut the shrub down close to the ground and then paint herbicide on it. So that way it's a smaller surface area, there's less chance of runoff, less use of herbicide. So there's different ways that we can tackle this. And I'm also looking into alternative management options. Some of them include smothering. So using, if you were to cut plants down very close to the ground and then place like a black PVC tarp over it, and over the summer, that's going to cook it, right? With the sun hitting the black tarp and absorbing the heat, it's going to cook the roots and plant material on the ground. And it would be another method of trying to minimize any disturbance to the land as well. So I'm trying to keep all that in mind, but also provide the options that we're currently using and try to gear towards alternative options and new ways of looking at managing the land on campus. I also got to dig into some aerial maps of campus before it was even UMBC. So this is Spring Grove Farm, the hospital. So there's a lot of agricultural history when it comes to understanding the UMBC's land use history. And that does come with land use disturbance. So that it is definitely a part of UMBC's history and also currently today with construction as well. This is some of the GIS work I'm continually working on. Okay. So on the left, I created a composite map. So what I did is I narrowed down those 100 plants to the top 40 plants of concern. And then I added up all of their rankings. So that means that if English ivy was a 3 in one grid and porcelainberry was a 2 in one grid, that would be a 5 ranking. So I took all of that and placed it on this map and then showed so darker areas have a higher amount of invasive plants and or a higher ranking of invasive plants. Lighter areas have a lower amount of invasive plants and or a lower ranking of invasive plants in terms of the coverage. So that was another way of showing which areas to implement long-term and short-term management practices. And then I wanted to peel back that layer and look at another way of managing campus. And something that we learned in GIS was creating buffers. So it is important to conserve the riparian forest buffers. And that is a 100-foot buffer that I put over the Herbert Run stream that runs through campus. So this is one area of priority. Another area is also the forest edges, and that's usually around campus. So we really want to prioritize especially trees and plants that are close to the roads, because we don't want trees that are full of invasive plants that are weakening the trees to eventually fall over on people or damage personal or campus property. So that's another like safety and liability concern. Facilities management wants to specifically prioritize the northeast portion of campus, especially because it neighbors with some townhomes and neighborhoods over here. That area also includes the forest conservation easement up top, as well as the Herbert Run Dam, the riparian forest buffer zone. So this is the #1 place that we're looking at for implementing management plan. There's also a forest conservation easement to the left of campus, or to the west, and that also overlaps with the riparian forest buffer and the forest edge. So it shows where there's a lot of overlaps. We definitely need to pay attention to these areas. Also, the knoll is actually not in that bad of shape compared to the Herbert Run and Sarah. So it could be another priority to tackle first, because that's something we could manage and definitely make a significant impact. And also starting with Sarah, starting from the edge of campus and then working our way outwards into the bulk of the forest is another important priority. So there's a lot that needs to be considered, and it definitely helped to create these maps and use the skills I learned as a GES student to the fellowship work I'm doing now. In February, it was a lot of event planning and professional development opportunities. So the week of the 20th was National Invasive Species Awareness Week. So I collaborated with the UMBC Office of Sustainability, the Eco Ambassadors, the Environmental Task Force Club, SGA, the GES Council of Majors, and Chartwell's UMBC Dining Services to set up a tabling event in Commons and talk to students and people who are interested in learning more about the issue of invasive species and what they can do. I created some QR codes so people could email their local representatives about reviving a forest conservation act that also includes invasive species management, and also a QR code to sign up for the Environmental Task Force Club. We're trying to bring back those invasive species cleanups as well as the trash cleanups on campus. So we actually got to start out the invasive species cleanup that Friday of that week with ETF. And Larry Hennessy is a great mentor for ETF and was really passionate about bringing back the invasive species aspect. So he came back, he actually retired last year, but he came back because he was super happy and excited that we were starting this up again and wanted to show students how simple it is to make an impact on even one tree. So in this picture, we were sawing off and using pruners to create window cuttings on English ivy stumps. So what that does is it'll kill off the top portion of the ivy on the tree without damaging the tree if you were to like pull off the ivy. So it's very environmentally conscious and minimizes any damage, but it's also very simple and a great educational opportunity for students to learn about this. I also presented with Ryan Kmetz and Claire Runquist from the Office of Sustainability for a professional panel night with the GES Council of Majors. So here we were talking about the work that we're doing and how students can get involved in any upcoming events. I also have some time for professional development. So I am taking some LinkedIn learning courses on Excel, and then I plan to take some courses through Esri for ArcGIS as well. This is a timeline of what I hope to get done through the rest of my fellowship, which ends in mid-June. So this is ongoing professional development, ongoing invasive species cleanups, finalizing that management plan, and carrying out the spring survey from the end of this month through April, and then doing the data analysis and ArcGIS work to create the new maps of any plants I might have missed and also any spring plants that show up as well. In April, we're planning some Earth Month events, and I can keep you guys posted and send information about that if you guys want to get involved with that. I'm also planning on working with facilities management to have a stakeholder meeting, so that way I can present the work that I've been doing and we can all be on the same page on what we want to prioritize and management practices and just working together and making sure that everyone's on board with this going forward. I plan to finalize everything by June and just wrapping up deadlines, and then I'm proposing at a Climate Corps symposium at the end of June to finish my fellowship. So there are quite a lot of lessons I learned so far. I wanted to highlight these top 5 because I think it's really important as someone who's in the professional realm, but also as a student and also just as a person in general. And the first one is sometimes there's never a right answer for everything. And that's something that you're going to face as a decision maker in a personal or professional context on any hierarchy at any level. And it's definitely hard. It can be, there's a lot of indecision at times, trying to make sure that you are doing things efficiently and effectively. And you really just need to go with the information that you have. And it is good to check with other people, but ultimately it is up to you. So really making sure that you're making a sound decision with the information that you have and the best management practices that are known. Also being proactive and taking initiative with professional development opportunities and keeping in touch with your professors and colleagues and networking. I found out about this fellowship thanks to the GES grad listserv. My advisor, Maggie Holland, actually posted this position. So it was important to just keep in contact with people who are here to support you. And just don't be afraid to ask for help. And also don't be afraid to pitch your ideas, even if they are big ideas, because the worst thing you can be told is no. It's better to at least pitch them and not have to regret that you never said anything in the first place. There's a lot of challenges being a professional, especially like being a young professional just out of college. But it's important to keep these things in mind going forward and just know that everyone grows at their own pace. I originally was going to start the graduate program and decided to take some time off from school and just take care of myself, but also making sure that no matter what I'm doing, I'm happy and fulfilled in what I'm doing. I'm learning something constantly. I don't like to call myself an expert because I feel like we're always going to be students, right? We're always going to learn something new. So it's important to realize and recognize that everyone grows at their own pace and everyone's going to learn something new and experience things based on their lived experiences. I just wanted to say thank you for your support. I'm really happy to still be a part of the UMBC and GES community, and I'm really grateful to be able to present to you guys. And if you have any questions, you can email me. Here's my email. There's also a link for the sustainability page. We're going to create a living web page for the invasive species management plan and any updates, and then the final draft of that plan will also be up there as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, there's only a handful of us in the room here, but we're going to go ahead with Q&A. I will tell you that we've got like 30 people logged in, so you have a bigger audience than it looks like in the room here. So terrific talk, really well organized, and I want to just encourage anybody who's here and has a question, you can start by asking questions, and then we'll open it up to the people who are online. I will open up the chat and ask for anyone who wants to ask a question, post in the chat that you want to ask a question, and we'll get to you in order. So anyone here want to start? I'll let you decide who you pick.
Hi, so first of all, great talk. I love seeing the work that you're doing, like also like trying to work with the Office of Sustainability. I've definitely heard your name and like all the initiatives that you're doing. So first of all, great presentation. But for my question, when you were mentioning the goats and like how they're eating like the invasive species, this might be a little bit of a gross question, but like I know that sometimes like plants travel like through like animal feces. So like do you actively have to like be aware like of the goats like pooping and like possibly spreading seeds that way? Like do you like pick up after them? Or like do you like groom them off to like not spread like seeds that way and stuff?
That's a great question. I also asked the goat herder. So goats, for the most part, are able to digest the plant material and plant seeds. I think there are a few plants that aren't, that still pass through. So it is important to keep in mind like which plants to target and like which plants they should avoid. So it's a little bit of a mix of both that, but also cleanup is important too.
Thank you.
So I was curious about the glyphosate slide. So you did talk a bit about how it's like used like as a herbicide and as a pesticide. Do you know how often it's being used on campus, and do you know how many pounds of glyphosate are being used?
I don't have the information or statistics about that, but if that's something you want to follow up about, I can try to get information about
Yeah,
that.
I'm just curious about that. Thanks.
This was awesome to hear about. It sounds like you've been all over the campus. I was interested in hearing more about your plans for the spring surveying. Are you trying to validate what you've already surveyed, or are you looking for new things?
It's a bit of a mix of both. Just making sure that the ones that I did find are still there, or if I missed any plants that I wasn't able to identify early on in the survey, I can go back and check my work with that. And then there's also some spring ephemerals, like I think it's called lesser celandine, and it's like a ground cover type plant that shows up like early spring. So I wasn't able to find that in the fall, so like looking for certain plants that pop up early in the season. So it's a little bit of a mix.
Cool.
Well, I'm going to ask you to stop sharing that and see if you can share your screen so that you're featured on the screen rather than me. So go ahead and share screen again, but share the window that is your what your camera's showing. I don't know if you can do that or not. Give that a try. So if you go to share, no, go to, well,
You can just
move yourself to stage. Try that.
Yeah. You just pin yourself.
Okay.
And then Andy, yeah.
And then
Unpin yourself.
well, actually, that's not what's showing up on the WebEx anyway. So try, if you share screen, is there any way you can share that view on screen? I don't mean to take up a lot of time. It's just nice to be able to see the speaker and not just some tiny little window.
Well, usually WebEx does that automatically if she's speaking.
That's true. Well, it's not what's happening here, but okay. So I'm gonna. Okay, you see. Okay, Anisha says we could see Bella. So, folks, anybody else here want to ask a question before I throw it open to everybody? So, anybody? Okay, here's a question. Dawn, you want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question?
Hi. that was a great talk, Bella. It's so exciting to see what you're doing and everything you're learning. So I have a substantive question and a question that suits my personal interests. And my substantive question is, what will it really take over the coming years in terms of resources like money, volunteer time, paid time of staff to really protect the trees that are being, the trees and other entities in our areas on campus, our vegetated areas on campus, from these spreading vines and herbaceous species. And my personal question is, well, is this goat thing going to happen or what?
These are great questions. So it's a mix of figuring out funding on campus, but also looking at grant opportunities outside of campus. And also for volunteer opportunities, I know that certain clubs and organizations on campus need to meet a volunteer requirement. So this could be something that they could do on campus and be involved with. So it's a mix of looking on campus what the funds are and doing cost estimates, and then also looking for grants as well. It's still definitely up in the works. I still need to figure out with facilities management what that cost is going to look like and what the funding would look like for that as well. With the goats, that is also a great question. I will need to do some cost calculating for that too, what it would take to work with different organizations in Maryland. I've heard of eco goats, so there's different local organizations that we can work with. So I need to come up with a cost for that and propose that to facilities management.
Awesome, thank you. It's interesting to know that in the past, goats have been seen as really bad for landscaping because they are they're browsers, so they will, you know, climb their hooves up a tree to eat the foliage. But it's great to see their reputation getting kind of recuperated, and they can be a helper in the landscape.
I agree. It's good to work with nature and like what they naturally do. I'm just trying to be more conscious of that as well. It'd be great to work with goats too. They're so fun.
So Tyra said, I can get behind that. I guess that meaning goats. But then Anita Kramer said, my Labrador Retriever used to eat Japanese stillgrass.
Oh, really?
We may not need to change the mascot.
That's a good
Anyway,
point.
does anybody else have any questions?
I do need to plug in my laptop.
Okay, so folks, if you want to say something, just unmute because Bella can't see. I'm not sure Bella can see the chat. So
Okay, this is Valerie. I can I had my little hand raised virtually, but I can just
yeah,
voice my
I
question.
can't see those. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much, Bella, for your time and your presentation. It was really great to see everything that you've worked up through so far. And I did join about 5 minutes late, so you might have already answered this question, but were there any challenges structurally as far as like limitations within your fellowship that kind of prevented you from doing something you wanted to explore further, or were there any yeah, I guess just organizational challenges that way in like the way your fellowship is structured?
For sure, there were challenges I faced. I think a lot of it just has to do with understanding what the university is able to do and is restricted from doing, and also funding is a big issue. Just understanding like how much we're able to dedicate towards something, which is why it's going to take some time to get an example of like how much it's going to cost to do this. So that's why like the management plan is more of like providing options. So whenever we do have the funds and like manpower available and that can tackle this issue, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, anybody else?
Great talk, super interesting. I'm wondering, so you did all this great work to like figure out where the limits are and have this plan of like how to, you know, try and improve stuff. Is there any plan or intention for like following up in terms of monitoring to like see if things are working?
Yeah, it would be a good idea to have like a short-term plan and a long-term plan for monitoring. Something that could be done like twice a year, like in the spring and fall, to do surveys. I'm not sure exactly how that will be carried out, but I do want to like list some recommendations and then figure out, just get some feedback to figure out what could actually be implemented and what would need to be held off. And also with certain management practices, for example, with like smothering, you could actually leave that on for a growing season or a couple of growing seasons. So you'd have to come back after a year to just take off the tarp and get rid of any residual stuff. Also with some herbicide applications and cutting as well. In order to exhaust like the root reserves for certain plants, you need to come back several times per season, depending on the plant. So there's different things in the short term and long term to keep in mind that I want to make. Does that answer your question?
Yep. Thank you.
So I just thought of something because of that.
Yeah.
I know you're talking. Are you like looking into like invasive species in terms of like bugs or smaller pests in addition to plants, or is it focused exclusively on plants for now?
It's mainly on plants, but also invasive insects are another priority. So just figuring out like monitoring practices from other management plants, including that. I know especially with the emerald ash borer, like a lot of ash trees are dead on campus, besides the one specimen ash tree we have. So it's important to keep in mind like, the monitoring practices.
Is there a way to deal with that?
There are some ways, setting up certain traps. A lot of it comes with monitoring, and there's different, I think like there's different chemicals that you can put in certain trees to like help it be like strong and like be able to prevent any sort of threat from invasive pests as well. I do need to do some more research on that, but that is something that I looked up and was curious about because that is something that's being done over the country.
So I'm curious, you did a number of events where you met with student groups or where you did tabling. What kind of interest did you get? Did you get anything like a group of volunteers that would actually be interested in doing things repeatedly?
Yeah, some people did sign up for the Environmental Task Force Club, and then also just it was general curiosity and just wanting to learn more about what's going on campus. So it was definitely more on that side, and then some people did sign up to volunteer for the cleanups as well. And then I figured just because people are passing by, they might not have enough time. The QR codes were beneficial for people to just scan really quickly. That email that I talked about to send out to local representatives was something that was already like pre-filled, so all they had to do pretty much was just hit send.
Very nice. Okay, anybody else have any questions before we close? Chris Schumann wants to ask you a question. Chris, go ahead and unmute.
Thanks. Coming from the land of the Bradford pear, Prince George's County, I live right next to the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center. There is no doubt at this time of year when they bloom so early, just how widespread that kind of problem is, especially now that they've hybridized and are no longer sterile, as was originally intended. I mean, it's just a massive problem down this way, and you can see it all along the major roadways, quite obviously this time of year. How do we get, which is a pretty environmentally forward state, engaged and have resources to meet the scale of this invasive species? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. I know Bradford pears are another issue, right? They were introduced and planted intentionally for ornamental purposes. In terms of looking at resources and funding, it's really a mix of like state government and what the University System of Maryland is able to provide. I don't necessarily have a detailed answer to that question because I'm still trying to figure that out myself. So that's an ongoing thing that I'm trying to look into.
Thanks. Great talk.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else have any questions before we close? So you had a lot of complimentary comments on in the chat here too. Okay, not hearing any, I think we'll go ahead and bring it to a close. Thanks, Bella, for really well-organized, really interesting talk. So, and we will get once we get the recording back, we will have it posted so that everybody can watch it.
Thank
Or
you.
anybody who couldn't watch it today. Thanks.
Great job, Bella. Bye.
Okay.